Everybody keeps asking the same question right now. Not about where the family is. Not about the house. Not even about what already happened. But about what happens next. Because there's a date sitting out there. And once a date exists, people start building expectations around it. They start connecting dots. They start predicting outcomes. And in this case, the focus is narrowed down to one name. Eric. The question isn't subtle anymore. Is he going to be charged next? Now, before anyone jumps to conclusions, there's something that has to be made clear right away. There's a difference between what people feel and what can actually be proven. A big difference. And most of the noise you're hearing right now is built on that gap. Because people watch things unfold in real time. They saw behavior. They heard promises. They watched money move. And now they are trying to turn what they saw into conclusions. But seeing something happen doesn't automatically explain what it legally means. And that's where this situation gets complicated. Because emotionally, a lot of people have already made up their minds. Legally, that process hasn't finished yet. And those two timelines don't move at the same speed. Now let's step back and look at why Eric's name is coming up again. Because it's not random. It's tied to a pattern people believe they saw. Fundraising. Promises. Statements about where money came from. Statements about how money was used. And inconsistencies that didn't sit right with people watching. That's the core of it. Not one moment, but a series of moments that, when placed together, started raising questions. And once those questions start, they don't go away easily, especially when money is involved. Because money changes everything. It changes perception. It changes expectations. It changes accountability. And in situations involving vulnerable people, it raises the stakes even higher. Now here's the part that needs to be handled carefully. There are claims. There are opinions. There are interpretations of what happened. But those are not the same as verified conclusions. And if you don't separate those things, you end up building a narrative that feels complete, but isn't actually confirmed. So instead of jumping straight to outcomes, let's break this down properly. What are people actually reacting to? First, public behavior. People saw requests for donations. They saw explanations about how funds were being used. And then they noticed differences between what was said and what appeared to happen. That creates doubt. Second, control. Who was managing the money? Who decided where it went? Who had access to it? And how transparent that process actually was. Because once control becomes unclear, trust starts to break. Third, consistency. Were statements consistent over time? Or did they change depending on the situation? Because inconsistency doesn't prove wrongdoing, but it does raise questions. And those questions are what people are reacting to right now. Now bring in the timeline. Because timing matters here. There were investigations. There were reports. There were actions taken involving other individuals connected to the situation. And once one part of a situation becomes official, people assume the rest will follow. That's where the expectation around May is coming from. Not confirmed outcomes, but the belief that the process is still moving. Now here's where things get even more layered. Because Eric isn't the only name that's been part of this conversation. Patrick is still in it. And the dynamic between those two matters. Because when two people are involved in the same situation, accountability doesn't always land evenly. Sometimes one becomes the focus. Sometimes both do. Sometimes the situation splits in ways people didn't expect. And that's why you're hearing speculation about one being charged, the other not. Or one cooperating. Or one taking the fall. All of that is being discussed. But again, discussion is not confirmation. Now let's address something else that's influencing how people see this. Trust. Because once trust is broken, everything that follows gets filtered through that. Every action. Every statement, every explanation. People stop asking what happened and start asking what's being hidden. And once that shift happens, it's very hard to reverse. That's where a lot of the current reaction is coming from. Not just the events themselves, but the perception that something wasn't handled honestly. Now here's the part that matters most. What actually determines whether charges happen? Not opinions, not online discussions, not how people feel about someone's character. Evidence, documentation, financial records, statements that can be verified, consistency that can be tested. That's what matters. And that process takes time. More time than people expect. Because while the internet reacts instantly, legal systems don't. They move slower. They require proof. They require verification. They require structure. And until that process finishes, everything else is just speculation. Now that doesn't mean nothing will happen. It doesn't mean everything is fine. It just means the outcome isn't decided by public opinion. It's decided by what can actually be proven. And that's where things stand right now. In between. Not resolved. Not closed. Still moving. And that's why this moment feels so tense. Because people are waiting, watching, trying to predict something that hasn't been finalized yet. So now we come back to the central question. Is Eric about to be charged next? The honest answer is this. There are reasons people believe that. But there is no confirmed outcome yet. And until there is, everything else is assumption. Now here's the part that matters for you. Not what people are saying. Not what they think will happen. But how you interpret what you've seen. Do you trust the pattern you observed? Or do you wait for verified conclusions before deciding? Because that choice changes how you see everything. And that's where the conversation is right now. Not at the end, but right before it. Comment below. Do you think what people saw online is enough to predict what happens next? Or should we wait for confirmed evidence before making that call? Once people start talking about charges, the conversation almost always shifts in the same direction. Not toward facts, but toward character. Who is this person really? What kind of person would do that? Can you trust anything they say? And in this situation, that shift has already happened. Because for a lot of people watching, this is no longer just about actions. It's about patterns of behavior. And more specifically, whether those patterns suggest intent. Now here's where things get complicated. Because intent is one of the hardest things to prove. You can see what someone did. You can hear what they said. But proving why they did it, that's different. And that's where most online discussions break down. They assume intent based on behavior. But legally, assumption doesn't hold. You need evidence that connects actions to purpose. And that's not always easy to establish. So instead of jumping straight into conclusions, let's break down what people are actually pointing to. What patterns are being discussed? The first one is control of narrative. Who was telling the story? Who was presenting information to the public? And how consistent that information was over time. Because when one person controls how a situation is explained, they also influence how it's understood. And if that explanation changes, or doesn't match what others observed, it creates doubt. That's one of the key concerns people have raised. The second pattern is financial representation. What was said about money, where it came from, how it was used, and whether those statements aligned with reality. Because when financial claims don't match what people can verify, it raises a serious question. Not automatically about wrongdoing, but about accuracy. And accuracy matters more than anything in situations like this. The third pattern is shifting responsibility. Who was accountable for what? When something went wrong, who took ownership? And when something went right, who took credit? Because patterns of shifting responsibility can suggest something deeper. Not proof, but direction. Now combine those three patterns together. Control of narrative, financial inconsistencies, shifting responsibility, and you start to understand why people are focusing on this so heavily. Because taken individually, each one might not mean much. But together, they form a pattern people are trying to interpret. Now here's where things get even more layered. Because interpretation is influenced by experience. What people have seen, what they've dealt with before, what they recognize. And that's why reactions vary so much. Some people look at this and see clear warning signs. Others see misunderstanding. Others see exaggeration. And that difference in interpretation is what's driving the current divide. Now let's bring Patrick back into the conversation. because his role changes how Eric is being viewed. Not directly, but comparatively. People are watching how one situation is handled, and then applying that expectation to the other. If Patrick faces consequences, people expect similar outcomes for Eric. If one is held accountable, they assume the other should be too. But that's not how it always works. Because even when two people are involved in the same situation, their roles can be very different. Their actions can be different. Their level of control can be different. And those differences matter legally, even if they don't feel different emotionally. So when people say, if one is charged, the other should be too, what they are really expressing is fairness, not necessarily legal reality. And fairness doesn't always translate directly into outcomes. Now let's talk about something else that's influencing all of this. Reputation. Because once someone's reputation shifts, everything they do gets viewed differently. Things that might have been ignored before become suspicious. Statements that might have been accepted before get questioned. And actions that once looked neutral start to look intentional. That's the power of perception. And right now, perception is playing a huge role. Because people aren't just looking at isolated moments anymore. They are looking at a larger narrative, trying to connect pieces, trying to make sense of everything as a whole. Now here's the risk in that. When you connect enough pieces, you can create a story that feels complete, even if some of those connections aren't fully verified. And that's where caution matters. Because it's very easy to move from this looks suspicious to this must be true. And that jump is where accuracy gets lost. So instead of jumping, let's slow it down again. What do we actually know? We know there were public fundraising efforts. We know statements were made about how money was handled. We know people observed inconsistencies. We know concerns were raised. We know investigations have already touched parts of this situation. But we do not have confirmed legal conclusions about Eric yet. And that distinction is critical, because everything else depends on it. Now let's address the idea that keeps coming up. Next month will reveal everything. That's what people are saying. That May is the turning point. But here's the reality. Legal processes don't operate on expectation timelines. They operate on evidence timelines. And those two things rarely align perfectly. So while something could happen, it's just as possible that things continue moving quietly, without a public moment, without a dramatic reveal. And that's something people need to be prepared for, because not every outcome is visible immediately. Now let's talk about accountability in a broader sense. Because even if legal charges don't happen right away, that doesn't mean accountability doesn't exist. Accountability can show up in different ways. Loss of trust, loss of platform, loss of influence, changes in how people engage. And those shifts are already happening. Because once people start questioning behavior, the environment changes, even without legal action. And that's important to recognize. Because accountability isn't only defined by charges. It's also defined by consequences. Social, financial, reputational. All of those matter. Now here's where things come back to you. Because at the center of all this discussion is a decision. Not about what will happen, but about how you interpret what you've already seen. Do you trust your observation of the patterns? Do you believe those patterns indicate something serious? Or do you think the situation is being overstated? That's the real divide. Not facts. Interpretation of facts. And until there's a confirmed outcome, that divide stays. Now let's return to the core question again. Is Eric about to be charged? At this point, what exists is expectation, not confirmation. An expectation is built on patterns people believe they've identified. But belief is not the same as proof. And proof is what ultimately decides everything. So where does that leave this story? In the same place it was at the end of part 1. Waiting, but not empty waiting. Active waiting. Watching. Analyzing. Trying to predict. And that's where things will stay. Until something official changes. Comment below. Do you think patterns of behavior are enough to predict legal outcomes? Or do you believe only confirmed evidence should matter in situations like this? At this point, The conversation isn't really about one person anymore. It's about a system that formed around this family, and what that system turned into over time. Because if you only look at Eric, or only at Patrick, you miss the bigger structure that allowed everything to happen in the first place. And that structure matters more than any single name. Because systems repeat. People come and go. But systems, if they aren't corrected, keep producing the same outcomes. So before anyone decides what happens next, you have to understand what actually existed here. Not the simplified version, the real one. A vulnerable family, limited resources, limited oversight, high public attention, money entering the situation quickly, and no clear structure controlling how that money, attention, and access were managed. That combination is unstable. Not sometimes, always. And when that kind of instability forms, it doesn't take a mastermind to create problems. It only takes gaps. Gaps in oversight, gaps in accountability, gaps in communication. And once those gaps exist, different people fill them in different ways. Some try to help. Some try to benefit. Some don't fully understand what they are stepping into. And some know exactly what they are doing. The problem is, from the outside, those roles don't always look different at first. Helping and benefiting can look identical in the beginning. That's what makes situations like this so difficult to read in real time. Because the shift from this is helping to this is being used doesn't happen instantly. It happens gradually. Now let's apply that to what people saw. When the situation first became public, there was attention, then support, then money, then involvement from multiple people, then more attention, and slowly, without a clear system controlling it, everything started overlapping. Content, care, money, access, all happening at once. Now here's the key question. Who was responsible for managing that overlap? Because that's where things either stabilize or fall apart. And in this case, it looks like that responsibility was never clearly defined. Or if it was, it wasn't consistently enforced. Which leads to the situation we're seeing now. People trying to assign responsibility after the fact. Trying to figure out who should have done what. Who controlled what? Who knew what? And that's why Eric's name is being discussed so heavily. Because people believe he was in a position where he should have known more, should have controlled more, should have acted differently. But again, belief is not proof. And that's the line that keeps getting blurred. Now let's go deeper into something people don't talk about enough. Visibility. Because once this family became visible, everything changed. Not just for them, but for everyone around them. Because visibility creates value. Attention becomes currency. And once attention becomes currency, behavior shifts. People start thinking differently, acting differently, positioning themselves differently, and not always consciously. Sometimes it happens without people even realizing it. But the effect is the same. The situation becomes something more than just a family. It becomes a platform, and platforms attract activity. More people, more opinions, more involvement, more complexity. And if there isn't a structure controlling that platform, it becomes chaotic. That's what you're looking at now. The result of a situation that became bigger than the system holding it. Now bring that back to Eric. Because the reason people are focusing on him is tied to perceived control. They believe he had a level of control within that system. Over money, over narrative, over decisions. And when control is assumed, responsibility follows. But here's the problem. Assumed control is not the same as actual control. And unless that control can be proven, responsibility can't be assigned in a legal sense. That's where the gap is. Between what people think happened and what can be demonstrated. Now let's talk about something else that's influencing everything right now. Hindsight. Because hindsight is powerful. Once people look back, everything starts to feel obvious. They should have seen this. That should have been a red flag. That didn't make sense. But in real time, those things don't always look clear. They look like normal parts of a complex situation. And that's why hindsight can be misleading. It creates clarity after the fact, But that clarity didn't exist in the same way during the moment. So when people say, "We saw it happen," what they often mean is, "We understand it better now." And that difference matters, because understanding something after it happens doesn't automatically prove what someone intended while it was happening. Now let's go even deeper. Motivation, because this is where most people try to land. Why did someone do what they did? Was it intentional? Was it careless? Was it manipulative? Or was it something else entirely? And this is where speculation gets the strongest, because people fill in motivations based on patterns. If behavior looks inconsistent, they assume deception. If behavior looks calculated, they assume intent. If behavior looks careless, they assume negligence. But assumptions about motivation are still assumptions. And that's why legal processes don't rely on them alone. They rely on evidence. Clear connections between action and outcome. Clear documentation. Clear proof. Now here's the uncomfortable truth. The internet doesn't need that level of proof to form an opinion. But the legal system does. And until that standard is met, everything else remains unresolved. Now let's step back again. What do we actually have? A situation where people observed behavior they found questionable. Patterns emerged that didn't feel consistent. Trust began to break down. Multiple individuals became involved. Investigations have already touched parts of the situation. And now there's an expectation that more is coming. That's where we are, not at the conclusion, but at the intersection of observation and expectation. And that's a dangerous place to be, because it feels like the story is already finished, when it's actually still unfolding. Now here's something most people overlook. Outcomes don't always match expectations. Just because something looks one way publicly doesn't mean it will resolve that way legally. And that's what creates tension, because people want alignment between what they saw and what happens next. But that alignment isn't guaranteed. Now bring everything together. A system that wasn't stable. Multiple people operating within it. Money and attention creating pressure. Patterns that raise concerns. And a process that hasn't fully concluded yet. That's the reality. Not simple, not clear, but real. So when you ask, is Eric about to be charged? What you're really asking is, will the patterns people believe they saw translate into provable legal responsibility? And that answer isn't based on opinion. It's based on evidence, which means we're still in the same place, waiting, but now with a clearer understanding of what's actually at stake. Because this isn't just about one person. It's about how a system failed to hold, and what happens when that failure gets examined closely. Comment below. Do you think situations like this are caused more by individuals, or by systems that weren't strong enough to handle what came with attention and money? At some point, every story like this reaches a moment where the noise fades just enough for one question to remain. Not the loud question, not the one built on rumors or predictions. The quieter one. What actually changes after all of this? Because that is where the real weight of the situation sits. Not in what people believe happened, but in what happens next. And right now, everything is sitting on that edge. Because if Eric is charged, the story shifts in one direction. If he isn't, it shifts in another. But either way, something fundamental has already changed. And most people haven't fully processed that yet. Because the biggest shift didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in perception. For a long time, this situation existed as something people watched, followed, discussed, argued about, but still, in some way, consumed. Now it's different. Now it's being examined, questioned, picked apart at a level that goes beyond surface reactions. And once that happens, it doesn't reverse. Because once people start asking deeper questions, they don't go back to just watching. They start evaluating, reassessing, reframing everything they thought they understood. That's where this story is now. Not just in motion, but under scrutiny. And scrutiny changes everything. Because it forces structure. It forces clarity. It forces accountability. Even before any official outcome is reached. Now here's something important to understand. Accountability doesn't always come from a charge. Sometimes it comes from exposure, from patterns being recognized, from behavior being reevaluated, from trust being broken in a way that doesn't repair easily. And that's already happened here. Regardless of what happens legally, people have already formed conclusions about what they saw. Some believe strongly that Eric should be held accountable. Others believe the situation is more complicated. Some think responsibility is shared. Others think it's been misdirected entirely. And those divisions won't disappear just because a decision is made. Because once trust fractures, it doesn't follow legal timelines. It follows perception. Now let's talk about something most people avoid. Responsibility beyond legality. Because legal responsibility is one thing. Moral responsibility is another. And they don't always align. Someone can avoid legal consequences and still carry moral weight in the eyes of the public. At the same time, someone can be legally held responsible and still have people question whether that responsibility was fairly placed. That tension is exactly what you're seeing here, and it's why this situation feels unresolved even before it's concluded. Because people aren't just waiting for a legal answer. They are waiting for a sense of closure, and closure is harder to define. Because it doesn't come from paperwork alone. It comes from understanding, from clarity, from feeling like the outcome matches the reality people believe they witnessed. And that doesn't always happen. Now let's shift perspective again. Because there's something deeper underneath all of this. Something that existed before Eric, before Patrick, before any of the current discussions. The environment itself. Because the environment is what allowed everything else to happen. A vulnerable situation, limited structure, external attention, money entering quickly, multiple people interacting with different motivations. That combination creates instability. And instability doesn't resolve just by addressing one person. It requires a system change. Which raises another question. Has that change happened? Because if it hasn't, then the same conditions still exist. And if the conditions still exist, the outcome can repeat. Maybe not with the same names, but with the same pattern. That's what people should be paying attention to now. Not just who might be charged, but whether the structure around the situation has actually improved. Because without structure, accountability becomes temporary. Now let's bring it back to the present moment. The point everyone keeps referencing. The moment people believe something will happen. And maybe it will. Maybe there will be charges. Maybe there won't. But here's what doesn't change. The process itself. Because once something reaches this level of attention, it doesn't disappear quietly. It gets documented, reviewed, analyzed. And if there's enough there, acted on. But timing matters. And timing is something the public rarely sees clearly. Because investigations don't move at the speed of online discussion. They move at the speed of verification. And verification takes time. Which is why expectations often get ahead of reality. People want resolution. But resolution requires certainty. And certainty requires evidence. Now here's the part that's uncomfortable. There's a possibility that the outcome won't satisfy anyone completely. Because in complex situations, there isn't always a clean ending. Sometimes there's partial accountability. Sometimes there are unanswered questions. Sometimes there are outcomes that feel incomplete. And that's where maturity and understanding matters. Because not every story resolves in a way that feels fair, even if it's legally correct. Now think about what that means here. If Eric is charged, some people will feel validated. Others will question why it took this long. Some will ask if others should also be held responsible. If Eric isn't charged, some will feel frustrated. Others will say there wasn't enough proof. Some will shift focus to other individuals entirely. In both cases, the conversation continues. Because the underlying questions don't disappear. They evolve. Now let's talk about something that rarely gets addressed. The role of the audience. Because the audience isn't separate from the story. It's part of it. Attention fuels situations like this. Engagement amplifies them. Discussion spreads them. And sometimes, without realizing it, People contribute to the very complexity they are trying to understand. That doesn't mean people are at fault, but it does mean awareness matters. Because how people engage with situations like this influences how they unfold. Now step back one final time. What is this really about? It's not just about Eric. It's not just about Patrick. It's not just about one decision in May. It's about a chain of events that exposed something larger. How vulnerable situations interact with attention. How systems respond or fail to respond. How people interpret what they see. And how accountability is determined after the fact. That's the real story. And that story doesn't end with one outcome. It continues. Because the lessons from it either get applied or they don't. And if they don't, the pattern repeats. Maybe in a different place, with different people, but with the same structure. So the real question isn't just, is Eric about to be charged? The real question is, what have we actually learned from everything that led to this point? Because that answer matters more than any single outcome. Comment below. After everything you've seen, everything you've heard, and everything that's happened so far, do you think this situation will actually lead to change? Or just become another story people move on from once the next update comes? Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.